Psalm 52 begins with words that may sound kind of foreign until we hear the whole story, but we'll listen to them. It starts off with this as kind of an introduction before verse 1. To the choir master, a maskil of David, when Doeg the Edomite came and told Saul, David has come to the house of Ahimelech. And then in verse 1, why do you boast of evil, O mighty man? The steadfast love of God endures all the day, while your tongue plots destruction. Like a sharp razor, you worker of deceit. You love evil more than good, and lying more than speaking what is right. You love all words that devour, O deceitful tongue. Oh, David is worked up at this point. Anger at deceit, at lying. You can just feel the outrage. You can almost hear him shaking as he sings out these words describing a scandal against God and against his people. Verse 5 of Psalm 52 continues, but God will break you down forever. He will snatch and tear you from your tent. He will uproot you from the land of the living. The righteous shall see and fear and shall laugh at him, saying, see the man who would not make God his refuge, but trust in the abundance of his riches and sought refuge in his own destruction. Justice is coming, but against who? The story that we're going to get to in just a moment. In 1 Samuel 20 and 21, I think I said that wrong. I think it's 21 and 22. Anyways, there's many villains in this story. There is the guy who gets mentioned at the beginning of the psalm, a guy by the name of Doeg the Edomite, a slave of the king who looks after his flocks. There is Saul the king himself, who is focused deeply on what he thinks he's going to lose and what he does not have, and so much so that it is driving him mad. But we're going to come to a story in which there's only one liar. It's David himself. And this psalm is calling out justice against a liar, against someone who tells things that are not true for his own gain. And David is going to learn some very powerful and very hard lessons. But the good news for David, there's hope for this young man, even after failure. Verse 8 of Psalm 52 continues, but I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the steadfast love of God forever and ever. I will thank you forever because you have done it. I will wait for your name, for it is good in the presence of the godly. There is hope despite failure. Calling this sermon series, Arise, Anoint Him, which is looking back at something that would have happened stage several years earlier, in which the prophet of God, Samuel, comes to David, pours oil upon his head, and says that he shall be king. The Holy Spirit falls powerfully on David, but he's not ready to be king. In fact, the Bible describes David as a man after God's own heart. He is not ready to be described as a man after God's own heart. He has learned multiple lessons. We've seen this. You've been with us through this sermon series. We've seen him learn to worship. We've seen him rely on the true giant in the famous story of David killing Goliath. God is the true giant. He's gained a friend in the crown prince Jonathan, who truly cared about him and helped him to grow. But he could not become a great king. He could not become a great man of God until he lost everything. So we enter once again into the story of David. His life is an actual life, not idealized, not perfect. He needs to have his abilities, his pride broken, to learn absolute dependence on God. He's certainly going to be broken by other people's actions, but he's also broken by his own sin. He needs to find the victory in God alone. David's going to see some failures in his own life. We're going to look at those. And instead of becoming angry, becoming bitter, he leaves the story dependent. So we come to 1 Samuel, chapters 21 and 22. Oh, David is in trouble. Saul has continued to try to kill him in fits of passion. But a corner is being turned, and now it has become a relentless pursuit. David is fleeing the palace on the recommendation of the crown prince Jonathan, his good friend. His first stop as he flees from the palace is a place called Nob. It's only about an hour's walk from Gibeah, which was Saul's capital city. An hour's walk, not very far to go. It was an important place. As he got to Nob, he could look on a hill just across the valley from him. And that hill was later going to become his capital, Jerusalem. This hill, where Nob was on, becomes important centuries later when Jesus goes there to pray just hours before he's arrested. Today, if you go to that hill, it was just outside of Jerusalem then. Now it's practically downtown Jerusalem. It was a good place to run. For it was a place where the priests were. It was a place to go and inquire of God, to come and bring him your requests, your questions, your problems. A place to go and gather as people of God to worship. Ahimelech is the chief priest in charge. A few chapters before we entered into this story in 1 Samuel, he was called, we find the priest named Ahimelech. We don't know if it's talking about the same person, just a shorter version of his name, or a brother or something like that. But the point is, there's a priest there. And people gather to worship God and inquire of him there. And David goes to this place, a place to be reminded of promise, a place to worship, a special, holy place. And as he's walking into a place that was no doubt very familiar to him, he walks in with one thought on his mind. There is a mad king after me. And he comes in with an anxious look, an air that is strange to him. He's known well, but he seems off balance. And Ahimelech comes up to him. David, what's going on? Why are you all by yourself? You always come with a big group. And David starts sputtering. Oh, I'm on secret king stuff business. A need-to-know basis. I know I look alone, but I have a whole troop of soldiers out there waiting for me. that I'm supposed to catch up with. And he looks at Ahimelech. You know what? I left the palace in a hurry, and I kind of forgot to bring food with me. Do you have anything to spare? Ahimelech kind of a little stunned by the request. Maybe not a request for bread, but who it's coming from. And he kind of looks at David, and he's not sure what to do. And he starts to say, well, no, I don't. And he starts to think about it. He's got some bread. It's called the show bread, or the bread of presence. It's a type of bread that's talked about in Leviticus 24, where the people of God were to every week cook 12 loaves of bread, bake 12 loaves of bread, one per tribe of Israel, and put it on display that whoever came to worship could see it and be reminded of the promise and provision of God. It kind of reminded them of manna in the desert. It wasn't exactly as manna, but they would look at it, would remind them of things like that. And at the end of the week, the priests were to eat it. The priests had to eat it, having kept up the law, and they had to be right in the presence of God. And Ahimelech starts to think, well, I do have this bread. And David is an important person. He killed the giant. He's the king's armor bearer. He's an important guy, good friends with the crown prince. Maybe I should give it to him. So he says, I've got this. And David gladly accepts it. Now, the priest did not do wrong by doing that. Later Jewish writings say that certain elements of the ceremonial law could be set aside for times of great need if compassion could outweigh the following of the law in that way. In fact, if you go to Matthew's Gospel, Jesus praises this act, saying that in the same way that the priest gave this bread away, in the same way his disciples were allowed to do things on the Sabbath. So the priest's doing right. But when Jesus praises the priest, he does not praise David's dishonesty. He does not praise what David does that defiles this holy place. David. It's a little bit of relief. Well, maybe I got a little bit of help. Got some of the supplies he needs. This was a busy place, though. I mean, it was a center of worship. He kind of looks around and sees all sorts of people doing this and that. And he looks over and he sees one familiar face. Doeg. He's somebody else who had spent a lot of time in Saul's courts. And Edomite was a descendant of Esau. They were sworn enemies of Israel. He's probably in Saul's court because of earlier wars that occurred, and he had been a prisoner of war, brought in as a slave, and slaves could work themselves up to high positions within the palace, and he had done that. He'd become important. He was somebody who David knew was ambitious. Somebody who was willing to do almost anything to get the king's attention and to move up the ladder. Anything to impress the boss. And David sees him, and immediately, just a little tinkling of worry in the back of his head. Saul's going to find out where I am. Saul's angry with him. For the most part, that's a problem for another day. Because by the time Doeg can get back, tell Saul get down here, he's going to be long gone. But it does remind him, I really should have a weapon. So he looks at Ahimelech and says, yeah, I know I'm a soldier on this secret mission, but I kind of forgot to bring a weapon. You got anything I can borrow? Now he knows full well there's at least one sword there. There weren't a lot. We've talked about there were not a lot of iron swords in Israel at that time. But he knows of one, because he had put it there. After his great victory over Goliath, he had taken the sword of Goliath. And we talked about it a couple of weeks ago, that he created this as a memorial to remember his victory, so that people would remember, because it's easy to forget. Ahimelech had hummed and hawed. When he had been asked about the bread, should I give it to him or not? The bread and the sword were there for much the same reason. They were reminders to people. They were to remind us that God is victorious, that God gives us our provisions. But there's no real humming or hawing about this, because that sword really did belong to David. It really was his right to have it. And as a result, he goes, it's wrapped up, and to keep it protected, they unwrap it, and he gives it to David. And he rushes off with his bread and sword. We're going to come back to this story in just a second, but in the biblical account, there's two short vignettes before we get to the end. And they actually are important to this overall story. Because in this, we see David acting in such a way that he is more concerned with what is causing him stress, anxiety, this world pressure upon him. He's more worried about that than he is about the living God. And it's going to continue, because he leaves Nob, and he looks at Goliath's sword and says, where on earth am I supposed to go now? There's no place safe in Israel for me. And he looks at the sword, and he gets this crazy idea. I don't know fully where it comes from, but he knows Goliath is from a Philistine city called Gath, so why don't I go to Gath? Why don't I go to this Philistine city, because they're the enemies of Saul? So he gets there, and everybody immediately, what's he doing here? Isn't he our enemy? King Achan of Gath, who's going to become, who's going to become important. You're here on Family Day weekend. Sneak preview. He's going to come important that Sunday. 2 weeks. He's the king of Gath, and he says, okay, David shows up. Bring him up to me. And David doesn't know what to do, so he's in panic, starts to become dishonest. In a very different way this time. He starts to act, I don't know, like he's a madman. He starts drooling into his beard. He starts kicking things and defacing things, and he makes a big mess. He just acts like he's totally out of his mind. David looks pathetic. And the king looks at him and says, yeah, this guy's no threat. Throw him out. Don't ever bring him to my presence again. I don't want to see this crazy guy. So he goes from there. He leaves the Philistine territory. And he goes to basically to a cave, we're told. He finds the cave of Adullam. Adullam, we don't know much about a cave there. It kind of feels more like a hole in the ground if it's the place we think it is. But this had been a place that had been an important center of the Canaanites, but when the people of Israel came in, they kicked them out, and there was no city there, so now it's a wilderness place. It's abandoned. He finds some supplies there, and word starts to filter through to people that David's there. Particularly, his family gets word that he's there. And Saul, of course, he's searching for David. Who are the first people he goes to talk to? It's his family. They feel threatened. They catch wind David's there, and they go to him. And we're also told that other people start to show up. People who are in debts that they cannot possibly pay. People who are opposed to Saul. All sorts of riffraff. They all start showing up there. And David looks around and says, what am I going to do with it? Particularly he's worried, what am I going to do with my parents? He's worried that there's starting to become a group of outlaws and his elderly parents are along for the ride. So they go off. The Philistines live on one side of Israel. On the other side are the Moabites. They are also descendants of people from the book of Genesis, the descendants of Lot. They're also enemies of Israel, but he goes over there, he goes to the king of the Moabites, and he says, hey, how about we form an agreement? And you'll have an ally and a future king. You'll make Saul mad, who's your enemy. And in exchange, you look after my parents for a little while. I just let them stay here. So I agree. And it seems like David stays there for a few weeks with them. There's one gentleman who's with this group of riffraff. We don't know anything about him. His name is the prophet Gad. Doesn't appear in the story again. He confronts David. And I'm going to try to get the wording right, what he says. It's something along the lines of, thou shalt not stay in Moab. He deliberately tries to mimic the Ten Commandments as he's saying this. We don't catch it in English very well, but it's clear in the Hebrew. He's trying to mimic the Ten Commandments. He's trying to point out that in the book of Deuteronomy, that they were told never to make treaties and deals with Moab. And David is in violation. He's again being in a panic. He's doing what he is not supposed to do. There's two vignettes in between our story of David acting kind of in a panic. I run into what David's doing. I see this occasionally. Where somebody comes to talk to me and they've done something, or they're acting in a way that is ungodly. But they've got a good excuse for it. There's a good reason why I'm not obeying the Bible right now. It's okay for me to gossip. You should see what that person did. It's okay for me to act out and lash out like this. I'm justified. That's David right here. I'm justified in my sin. I'm allowed to do it. Well, anyways, it gets back to being in the desert and being in the desert and hiding. And the son of Ahimelech, I'm throwing a lot of Hebrew names. I'm sorry. The son of Ahimelech, Abiathar, he shows up and he recounts the rest of the story. David had left Nob. Doeg went right to Saul and said, David's there. He's with the priests. So Saul calls up the priests, says, what are you doing consorting with my enemy? And they immediately jump out. We didn't know he was your enemy. He's always been your ally. Saul is angry. He doesn't care what they have to say. He tells his guards, go kill all the priests. They refuse. He turns to Doeg. Well, you're apparently the one person loyal to me. You go kill them all. And he does. And only this one escapes. David is consumed with guilt. Nob was a special place. Place of worship. Place of meeting with God. Place of faith building. And David let fear and distress destroy that. Not just for himself, but his lack of faith destroyed it for everyone. God graciously gives us spaces and times to bask in his presence. And David is distracted from that. And he goes from a place of worship and focuses instead on anxiety rather than glory. Psalm 65:4. We read that a little earlier. Last part that we read, that Glenn read, was said, "Blessed is the one you choose and bring near to dwell in your courts. We shall be satisfied with the goodness of your house, the holiness of your temple." Satisfied with the goodness of your Lord. This whole idea of dwelling in the court, it's got exclamation marks. The Hebrew doesn't have exclamation marks, but the language is exciting. And it's trying to capture it somehow. Isn't it incredible to dwell in the courts of God, to be satisfied with the goodness of your house? God is holy. That holiness just means, it's a way to express that God is not like me. God is other. God is not just a bigger version of a human. God is majestic, wonderful. God is everything. He calls us to bask in that holiness. We need times, we need places to specifically meet Him. I don't know. Might have got up this morning, looked at the temperature. I did. Was not really thrilled. I'm not allowed to stay home on a cold day. But if I was, I would be tempted. I'm glad you're here. And obviously we have a smaller crowd today. I get it. Some places the roads are horrible. And there's going to be people who are going to catch up with this on the video sermon, and that's perfect. But you know what? We should be excited to meet with God. Not just showing up here because I should go to church and make God happy. Not just, well, maybe I'll see some friends. I should be excited because I get to bask in the presence of the Almighty today. And not just on Sundays. Morning devotions or evening devotions, whatever works for you. Times of prayer. Times maybe where I can be alone and turn on some worship music. Sometimes maybe driving down the highway and I can just turn on some songs that draw me closer to Jesus. I should be excited about those moments. Because it changes us. Does the stress of the world keep us from really knowing God? In my prayer times, Sunday mornings, and I often, even from the pulpit by the time I get up here, often I will be praying, God, I'm going to push aside the world, the stresses, the anxiety. Help me to focus. Because it's so easy to let the world chase away the opportunity to bask in the glory of God. We have a sacred space here. Now, does not mean that we should come here and never lie, but it's okay in the rest of the world. It's not what it's meaning. But that we keep sacred spaces as sacred. That we keep safe places safe. That we have times in our lives we set aside to focus on God. Certainly it's church times. Sometimes there's other moments of time where we do. There are certain seasons of the year where we consider sacred. I'll often mention that I've had a birthday in the past week. I'd like to pray with you. Done that. That all started with my kids when they were little, and I'd get up and make them pancakes for breakfast and then pray over them, especially. It became a little bit of a sacred space. That a birthday could be a reminder of the blessings of God. I like to do that. It's not that birthdays are necessarily set aside in the Bible as sacred. But there should be moments that we look at sacred and excited that I can focus on Jesus. Moments I can pray. Even bigger scenes. Maybe I look at certain moments of time that the family all gathers. And maybe the family doesn't always get a chance, but maybe at certain holidays everybody gets, and that's a sacred space. That I'm with all the people I love, and it brings about, grows love in my life. I look at it as a gift. We don't practice Lent. It's an idea in the liturgical church about spending 40 days preparing for Easter. And it's mostly because it became very rigid and things like that. But the concept is not bad. Taking a season and focusing on God, maybe even giving something up. And every time I miss it, it reminds me to pray and focus on God. Sometimes certain seasons of the year, like Christmas season and places like that, become sacred. It's important to take this sacred and use it to focus our hearts. Peter talks about this in his letter in 1 Peter chapter 4. He's talking about a crisis moment. The people are being persecuted. But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled. I want to say that's nice. How do I do that? How do I not be troubled when people are being cruel to me? How do I act like Jesus in those moments? And in verse 15 of 1 Peter 4, he gives us this. But in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy. Honor Christ the Lord. So do these things that you're building Jesus up in your life so that you're ready for these crisis moments. Enjoy the presence of God and let that be your guide when life gets busy, stressful, filled with fear. When we don't, we're like David. We make mistakes. We blow it. But when we do, we grow. We're always in the presence of the Holy. The Holy Spirit is in our lives. But to avoid falling, we need moments, days, seasons, places where I can focus on the Holy. Finding ways to ignore the enemy, sin, distraction, and instead focusing my eyes on glory. Let's find those places. Let's see this place as a safe place where I can shut out the world. And I can be honest, I can be real with God. A place where I can be vulnerable with my fears, with my failures. We're going to spend a few moments singing and seeking this holy God, worshiping Him, and not focused on stress, but preparing ourselves for a world of stress by seeing an all-powerful God. I'm going to sing a familiar chorus to conclude, Holy Ground. Let's see this truly as holy ground. I'm going to invite the worship team.